I was arranging the folding chairs in Grandpa's backyard when my brother Marcus walked up behind me and delivered the words that would change everything. You know what, Alex? You're absolutely worthless. 28 years old, and what do you have to show for it? No real job, no house, no family of your own. You're just a burden on everyone around you. His voice carried across the yard where our extended family was setting up for Grandpa George's 75th birthday party, and I could feel their eyes turning toward us. What Marcus didn't know, what none of them knew, was that in about 3 hours, those same words would taste like ashes in his mouth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The afternoon sun beat down on the perfectly manicured lawn of the family home on Maple Street in Millfield, Ohio. Grandpa George had lived in this Victorian house for 43 years, and today it was filled with the sounds of preparation, laughter, and the underlying tension that seemed to follow our family gatherings like a persistent shadow. I straightened another chair and glanced around at the scene unfolding before me. My mother Linda was fussing over the placement of the dessert table, my father Robert was testing the microphone for the speeches later, and my younger sister Emma was hanging string lights between the oak trees that had watched over decades of Thompson family celebrations. But it was Marcus who dominated the space, as he always did. At 32, my older brother had everything our parents had dreamed of for their children. He was the successful one, the responsible one, the heir apparent to Thompson's Diner, the small restaurant chain that had been our family's pride and joy for 2 generations. His wife Victoria stood beside him, her perfectly styled blonde hair catching the sunlight as she directed their teenage son Jake in hanging decorations. Everything about them screamed success, stability, and social acceptability. And then there was me, Alex Thompson, the family disappointment. At least, that's how they saw it. While Marcus had followed the expected path, graduating from Ohio State with a business degree and immediately joining the family restaurant business, I had taken what they considered a series of wrong turns. After college, I had moved away for what I told them was government work, a vague description that had satisfied no one and impressed even fewer. For the past 6 years, I had lived a life that seemed from the outside to be going nowhere. I rented a small apartment, drove an old Honda Civic, and rarely talked about my work in any detail that made sense to my family. The truth was more complicated, but truth had a way of being inconvenient at family gatherings. So I let them believe what they wanted to believe, let them draw their own conclusions about my life choices, and endured the subtle and not so subtle comments about when I was going to get serious about my future. Marcus wasn't content with subtle today. He had been building up to this moment all afternoon, I could tell. Every interaction had been laced with condescension, every conversation had been an opportunity for him to highlight his success and my apparent failure. When I arrived at the party that morning, he had made a show of asking me if I could afford to contribute to Grandpa's gift, a question that had been designed to embarrass me in front of our cousins. When I offered to help set up the sound system, he had dismissed me with a wave of his hand, suggesting that maybe I should stick to tasks that didn't require technical expertise. But calling me worthless in front of the entire family, that was a new low, even for Marcus. The conversations around us had quieted, and I could feel the weight of their attention. Aunt Margaret paused in her arrangement of the photo display. Cousin David looked up from the grill where he was preparing hamburgers. Even Jake, Marcus's 16-year-old son, had stopped what he was doing to watch the exchange. Victoria stepped up beside her husband, her smile sharp and knowing. "Oh, Marcus, don't be so harsh," she said, though her tone suggested she didn't mean it. "I'm sure Alex is doing his best. Not everyone can be as driven as you are." The false sweetness in her voice made the insult even sharper. She had perfected this technique over the years, the ability to deliver cutting remarks while maintaining plausible deniability. I felt the familiar surge of anger, the same feeling I had experienced countless times during these family gatherings. But I also felt something else, something that had been growing stronger over the past few months. Anticipation, because I knew something they didn't know. I knew that their comfortable assumptions about my life were built on a foundation that was about to crumble. You know what your problem is, Alex? Marcus continued, warming to his theme. The success of his initial attack had emboldened him, and now he was playing to his audience. You've never learned to take responsibility. You drift from one thing to another, never committing to anything, never building anything lasting. Look at me, look at what I've accomplished. The restaurants are doing better than ever. Victoria and I just bought the house on Elm Street. Jake's got a full scholarship to Northwestern lined up. That's what happens when you make smart choices and work hard. The irony wasn't lost on me. Marcus had inherited his position in the family business, had been handed opportunities that he had never had to fight for, had built his success on a foundation that had been laid by others. But pointing that out wouldn't help the situation, and it wouldn't change the fundamental dynamic that had defined our relationship for as long as I could remember. Marcus, that's enough, my father said quietly, but there was no real force behind the words. Robert Thompson had always been more of a peacekeeper than a protector, more concerned with avoiding conflict than addressing its root causes. His intervention was perfunctory, designed to ease the tension rather than address the underlying issues. My mother looked uncomfortable, glancing between Marcus and me with the expression she wore whenever family drama threatened to disrupt her carefully planned events. Linda Thompson was a woman who believed that problems could be solved by ignoring them long enough, and she clearly hoped that this confrontation would simply fade away if she didn't acknowledge it too directly. It was Emma who surprised me. My younger sister, who had always been the quiet one in the family, the one who avoided confrontation and tried to keep everyone happy, stepped forward with fire in her eyes. Why do you always do this, Marcus? Why can't you just let Alex be himself without constantly tearing him down? Marcus turned his attention to her, his expression shifting to one of patronizing patience. Emma, you're too young to understand how the world works. Alex needs to hear this. Someone needs to tell him the truth about his choices. He's 28 years old, living like he's still in college. When is he going to grow up and contribute something meaningful to this family? The word contribute hung in the air like a challenge. It was a favorite weapon in Marcus's.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Arsenal, the suggestion that worth could be measured by visible success, by the accumulation of possessions and status symbols that could be displayed and admired. By that measure, I was indeed worthless. I had no house to show off, no expensive car, no impressive job title that would spark conversations at cocktail parties. But I also had something Marcus didn't have, something none of them could imagine. I had knowledge. I had connections. I had a purpose that went far beyond the comfortable boundaries of Millfield, Ohio and the family restaurant business. And in just a few hours, that purpose was going to collide with this peaceful suburban birthday party in ways that would change everything. I looked around at the faces surrounding me, at the family members who had watched this exchange with varying degrees of discomfort and interest. Some of them looked sympathetic. Others seemed to agree with Marcus's assessment, but all of them shared the same fundamental assumption about my life, the same belief that what they could see was all there was to see. Grandpa George chose that moment to emerge from the house, moving slowly with his walker, but still radiating the dignity and presence that had made him the center of our family for as long as any of us could remember. At 75, he was still sharp, still engaged, still the person we all looked to for wisdom and guidance. His appearance immediately shifted the dynamic, and Marcus stepped back, his aggressive posture softening out of respect for the guest of honor. "What's all this commotion about?" Grandpa asked, his voice carrying the authority that came from decades of being the family patriarch. "This is supposed to be a celebration, not a debate." Marcus quickly arranged his features into a smile, the same practiced expression he used with difficult customers at the restaurant. "Just having a conversation with Alex, Grandpa, nothing to worry about." But Grandpa George hadn't survived 7.5 decades by accepting surface explanations. His eyes, still bright and alert behind wire-rimmed glasses, moved from Marcus to me and back again. "Alex, you all right, son?" The question was simple, but it carried weight. Grandpa had always been different from the rest of the family when it came to me. While the others focused on what I wasn't accomplishing, he seemed to understand that there were different ways to measure a life, different definitions of success and contribution. He had never pressured me to explain my choices or defend my decisions. "I'm fine, Grandpa," I said, and I meant it. Whatever discomfort I felt from Marcus's attacks was nothing compared to the anticipation building inside me. "Just helping get everything ready for your party." He studied my face for a moment longer, then nodded. "Good. Now Marcus, why don't you help your mother with those balloons? They're not going to tie themselves." The suggestion was delivered in the tone that had managed Thompson family dynamics for decades, and Marcus had no choice but to comply. As he walked away, Victoria following behind him with a slightly disappointed expression, I caught Grandpa looking at me with something that might have been understanding. "You know, Alex," he said quietly, "I've learned that the most important battles in life are often fought by people nobody's watching. Sometimes the heroes are the ones who don't get the recognition, who don't get the praise, who just do what needs to be done because it's right." His words hit me harder than Marcus's insults had. Grandpa didn't know the details of my life, didn't understand the specifics of what I did for a living, but somehow he understood something fundamental about duty and service that the others had missed. The party continued around us, the tension from the earlier confrontation gradually fading as people returned to their preparations. But I carried Grandpa's words with me as I moved through the afternoon, helping where I could, making conversation with relatives I saw only a few times a year, and waiting, always waiting. Because I knew that somewhere in Columbus, 30 minutes away, decisions were being made that would soon reach into this quiet suburban gathering. I knew that phones were ringing, that urgent conversations were taking place, that the careful boundary between my public life and my private life was about to dissolve completely. The sun was beginning to sink lower in the sky when my phone buzzed with a text message. I glanced at it quickly, noting the sender and the brief, coded message. Then I slipped the phone back into my pocket and continued arranging napkins on the dessert table, my expression unchanged. Soon, very soon now, Marcus appeared beside me again, apparently unable to let the earlier confrontation rest. "You know what I don't understand about you, Alex," he said, his voice lower now but no less condescending. "You had every opportunity, good family, good education, connections in this community, and you just threw it all away. For what? Some vague government job that doesn't seem to lead anywhere. It's like you're determined to be a failure." I looked at him, this man who shared my DNA but understood so little about the world beyond his comfortable assumptions. "Maybe success looks different to different people," I said quietly. He laughed, a sound without humor. "That's exactly what I'm talking about, these philosophical non-answers, this refusal to engage with reality. The rest of us are building something concrete, something lasting. What are you building, Alex? What do you have to show for 6 years of whatever it is you think you're doing?" The question hung in the air between us, and for a moment I was tempted to answer it, to explain that what I was building wasn't visible, wasn't something that could be displayed at family gatherings or bragged about at high school reunions. To tell him that some contributions to society were measured not in profit margins or property values, but in threats prevented, in security maintained, in problems solved before they became crises. But I didn't, because in less than an hour, Marcus would have his answer, and it would be delivered in a way that would leave no room for doubt or interpretation. As the afternoon stretched on, the party began in earnest. The backyard filled with the warm sounds of family conversation, children playing, and the gentle clinking of glasses as relatives toasted Grandpa George's milestone birthday. I moved through the gathering like a ghost, present but somehow separate from the celebration unfolding around me. The earlier confrontation with Marcus had created an invisible barrier between me and the rest of the family, a reminder of my status as the outsider, the disappointment, the one who didn't quite fit the Thompson family mold. Victoria had positioned herself near the dessert table, holding court with a group of my female cousins. Her voice carried across the yard as she regaled them with stories of Marcus's latest business triumphs, their new house, and Jake's academic achievements. Every so often, her eyes would find me across the yard, and she would lower her voice conspiratorially, no doubt sharing her theories about my failures and shortcomings. The other women would nod sympathetically, glancing in my direction with expressions that mixed pity with a kind of satisfied superiority. My cousin David approached me while I was helping to arrange the chairs for Grandpa's speech later in the evening. David had always been one of the more diplomatic members of the family, someone who tried to stay above the petty conflicts and jealousies that seemed to plague our gatherings. But even he couldn't completely hide his curiosity about my life choices. "So, Alex," he said, settling into conversation with the careful tone people used when they weren't sure if they were walking into a minefield, "how's the job going? Mom mentioned you're still doing that government thing." The government thing. That's how my family had come to refer to my career, as if it were some kind of hobby or phase I was going through. The vagueness was partly my fault, I knew. Over the years I had deflected their questions, given non-committal answers, and allowed them to fill in the blanks with their own assumptions. It had been easier than trying to explain the reality of my work, easier than dealing with the questions and concerns that would inevitably follow. "It's going well," I said, stacking another chair, keeping busy. David nodded, but I could see the frustration in his eyes. He wanted more, wanted details he could share with the others, wanted something concrete he could point to as evidence that I wasn't the complete failure Marcus had painted me to be, but I couldn't give him what he wanted, not yet. So we stood there in uncomfortable silence, the weight of unspoken questions hanging between us. The truth was that my work was anything but vague. For the past 6 years, I had been a federal agent with the Bureau, specializing in domestic terrorism and organized crime. My official title was Senior Special Agent, and I reported directly to a task force that coordinated with multiple agencies across the Midwest. The cases I worked on involved threats to national security, complex criminal enterprises, and situations that required months or years of careful investigation and planning. But explaining that to my family would have raised questions I couldn't answer, created concerns I couldn't address, and potentially compromised operations I couldn't discuss. So I had chosen the path of least resistance, allowing them to believe what they wanted to believe while I went about the business of protecting people who would never know my name or understand the sacrifices required to keep them safe. The irony was that Marcus's restaurant empire, the source of so much family pride, had actually benefited from my work in ways he could never imagine. 2 years earlier, I had been part of a task force that had dismantled a money laundering operation that had been targeting small businesses throughout Ohio. The criminals had been systematically infiltrating family restaurants, using them to clean drug money and eventually taking control of the businesses when the owners couldn't repay the loans they had been forced to take. Thompson's Diner had been on their list, scheduled for infiltration within 6 months of our operation. Marcus never knew how close he had come to losing everything, never understood that his continued success was partly due to the work of the brother he considered worthless. But I couldn't tell him that. The nature of my work required a level of secrecy that extended to my personal life, a separation between who I was at home and who I was in the field. It was a lonely existence sometimes, but it was also necessary. The moment my family knew the truth about my career, they would become potential targets, potential complications, potential liabilities in cases that required absolute discretion. So I endured Marcus's insults, Victoria's condescension, and the family's collective disappointment. I played the role of the underachiever, the black sheep, the one who couldn't quite get his life together, and I waited for the day when circumstances would force the truth into the open, when the careful boundaries I had maintained would finally collapse. That day I was beginning to realize, might be today. The party reached its peak as the sun began to set. Grandpa George held court in his favorite lawn chair, surrounded by children and grandchildren who hung on his every word as he told stories from his youth. The old man had a gift for narrative, a way of making even the most mundane experiences sound like adventures. Tonight he was regaling them with tales of his early days working for the Postal Service, when mail delivery was more personal, when he knew every family on his route, and could tell you their stories going back generations. "People don't understand what it means to serve," he was saying, his voice carrying the authority that came from a lifetime of experience. They think service is about getting recognition, about being thanked and appreciated, but real service, the kind that matters, that's usually invisible, the person who prevents the accident you never knew was going to happen, the person who solves the problem before it becomes a crisis. Those are the real heroes, and most of the time, nobody even knows their names. His words hit me with unexpected force, and I found myself wondering if somehow, despite all my careful secrecy, he had intuited something about my real life. Grandpa George had always been more perceptive than the rest of the family gave him credit for. He noticed things others missed, understood currents and undercurrents that flowed beneath the surface of family dynamics. Marcus, who had been only half listening to the story, chose that moment to interrupt with his own commentary. That's all well and good, Grandpa, but in the real world, you have to produce results people can see. You have to build something concrete, something that creates jobs and supports families. That's what real responsibility looks like. The comment was clearly directed at me, another opportunity for Marcus to highlight the contrast between his visible success and my apparent lack of achievement. Several family members glanced in my direction, waiting to see how I would respond to this latest provocation, but before I could say anything, my phone buzzed with an incoming call. I glanced at the screen and felt my pulse quicken. The number belonged to Director James Mitchell, my direct superior at the Bureau. Mitchell never called unless something significant was happening, something that required immediate attention regardless of where I was or what I was doing. I stepped away from the group, walking toward the far corner of the yard where I could take the call with some privacy. Thompson, I answered, keeping my voice low. Alex, we have a situation. Mitchell's voice was tense, urgent in the way that meant something big was breaking. Senator Patricia Hawkins has disappeared. Her security detail lost contact with her 3 hours ago. Last known location was approximately 15 miles from your current position. I felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with the beginning of a major case. Senator Hawkins was a high-profile target, someone whose disappearance would have national implications. If she was missing in my area, it meant I was about to become the point person on a case that would involve multiple agencies, extensive resources, and round-the-clock operations. What's the situation? I asked, already mentally shifting into operational mode. We're not sure yet. Could be kidnapping, could be something else. Her last communication was a text message saying she needed to handle something personally, and would be out of contact for a few hours. That was 6 hours ago. Her security team is in full panic mode, and we're treating this as a potential national security issue. Understood. What do you need from me? We're setting up a command center at the federal building in Columbus, but we need someone on the ground in your area immediately. Can you break away from whatever you're doing and start canvassing the area? Her phone last pinged from a tower that covers a 10-mile radius around your location. I looked back at the birthday party, at my family gathered around Grandpa George, at Marcus still holding forth about responsibility and achievement. In a few minutes, this peaceful suburban gathering was going to become the center of a federal investigation, and my carefully maintained secret was about to be exposed in the most dramatic way possible. I'm on it, I said, but Director, there's something you should know. I'm currently at a family gathering. When the team arrives, it's going to compromise my cover with my family. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Mitchell knew about my situation, understood the delicate balance I maintained between my professional and personal life, but he also understood priorities, and a missing senator trumped family privacy every time. I'm sorry, Alex, this is too big to work around your personal situation. We'll need to use your location as a staging area, if necessary. I'll have teams converging on your area within the hour. Understood, I said, though I felt a mixture of anticipation and dread at what was about to unfold. I'll start preliminary reconnaissance and wait for backup. I ended the call, and stood for a moment in the growing darkness, looking back at my family. They were still gathered around Grandpa, still lost in their comfortable assumptions about their world and their place in it. In less than an hour, federal agents would be arriving at this house, asking questions, taking statements, and treating the Thompson family birthday party as a potential crime scene. My role in that investigation would make it impossible to maintain the fiction that I was just drifting through life without purpose or direction. Marcus was about to learn what real responsibility looked like. Victoria was about to discover that her judgments about worth and value were based on incomplete information, and my entire family was about to understand that the world was far more complex and dangerous than they had ever imagined. I walked back toward the group, my mind already working through the logistics of what needed to happen next. I would need to subtly begin gathering information from the family and neighbors, trying to determine if anyone had seen anything unusual in the area during the past few hours. I would need to start establishing a perimeter and identifying potential witnesses or sources of information. And I would need to do all of this while maintaining the pretense that I was still just Alex the underachiever, at least until the cavalry arrived. As I rejoined the circle around Grandpa's chair, Marcus looked up at me with his familiar expression of mild contempt. "Important phone call?" he asked, the question loaded with implication. "Let me guess, someone calling about a job interview." The sarcasm in his voice was unmistakable, and several family members chuckled at what they perceived as good-natured ribbing. They had no idea that the phone call I had just received would, within hours, completely redefine their understanding of my life and capabilities. "Something like that," I said, settling back into my chair, and trying to appear relaxed despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "Work stuff." Victoria leaned forward with interest. "Oh, you're still doing that mysterious government thing. What exactly is it that you do again?" Her tone suggested that she expected another vague non-answer, another opportunity to share meaningful looks with the other family members about my lack of direction. For 6 years, I had deflected questions like this, had given non-committal answers that satisfied no one but protected the secrecy my job required. But tonight, with a missing senator and federal agents converging on our location, the carefully maintained separation between my two worlds was about to collapse. "I work in federal law enforcement," I said simply, watching as they think you were just drifting through life? "Because my work requires a level of secrecy that protects both the cases I'm working on and the people I care about," I explained. "The moment you knew the truth about my career, you became potential targets, potential complications in cases that involve dangerous people and situations you don't want to understand." The weight of this explanation settled over the group like a blanket. These were people who lived comfortable, predictable lives, who dealt with the manageable problems of running restaurants and raising children and maintaining suburban homes. The idea that their world intersected with federal investigations and national security issues was foreign to their experience. Victoria, who had spent the afternoon making subtle jokes about my lack of achievement, looked like she wanted to disappear into her chair. "I had no idea," she said quietly. "I thought you were just unemployed, or working some dead-end job." "I know what you thought," I said, not unkindly. "I let you think it because it was easier than explaining the truth." My phone rang again, and this time I recognized the ringtone that indicated an urgent call from headquarters. I answered immediately, aware that my family was hanging on every word. "Thompson here, Alex. We've got developments." Director Mitchell's voice was crisp, professional. "Senator Hawkins' security detail has been found. 2 agents are in critical condition at Columbus General. This is now officially a kidnapping case with federal jurisdiction. I need you to secure the area around your location and prepare to receive a full investigative team." "Understood, Director. I'll establish a perimeter and begin preliminary interviews with potential witnesses in the area." "Good. And Alex? I'm sorry about your family situation, but this case takes priority. Senator Hawkins' life may depend on how quickly we can piece together what happened and where she's been taken." "Copy that. I'll handle the family situation." "How long until the team arrives?" 15 minutes. Full tactical support, forensics team and crisis negotiators. We're treating this as a potential terrorism case until we know otherwise." I ended the call and looked around at my family, who were staring at me with expressions ranging from shock to admiration to complete bewilderment. The comfortable assumptions that had governed their understanding of my life had been completely shattered, and they were struggling to process the new reality. "So," Grandpa George said slowly, breaking the silence that had fallen over the group, "when you said you were keeping busy, you meant you were fighting crime and protecting national security." I couldn't help but smile at the understatement. Something like that, Grandpa. Marcus, who had spent the day lecturing me about responsibility and contribution, looked like he was reconsidering every interaction we had ever had. Alex, I don't know what to say. I had no idea. The things I said earlier, about you being worthless and not contributing anything, forget about it, I said, though I couldn't completely hide the satisfaction I felt at seeing his assumptions crumble. You didn't know because I couldn't tell you, but right now we have a more immediate problem. In about 10 minutes, this backyard is going to be filled with federal agents investigating the kidnapping of a United States senator. Your birthday party just became a crime scene. The implications of this statement began to sink in around the circle. Family members looked at each other with growing alarm as they realized that their peaceful suburban gathering was about to be invaded by law enforcement personnel treating them as potential witnesses or suspects. "What do you need us to do?" Emma asked, and I could hear the trust in her voice, the immediate shift from seeing me as the family failure to seeing me as someone in authority, someone who knew how to handle crisis situations. "I need everyone to stay calm, cooperate fully with the agents who are about to arrive, and answer their questions honestly. A senator's life is at stake, and any information you might have, no matter how insignificant it seems, could be crucial to finding her." As if on cue, we heard the sound of vehicles pulling up in front of the house. Car doors slammed, and I could see the beams of high-powered flashlights beginning to sweep the front yard. The federal investigative team had arrived, and my two worlds were about to collide in the most dramatic way possible. I stood up, automatically shifting into the professional mode that had become second nature over 6 years of federal service. "Everyone stay here, I'll go brief the team, and then they'll want to interview each of you separately." As I walked toward the front of the house, I could hear the murmur of shocked conversation beginning behind me. My family was trying to process what they had just learned, trying to reconcile the Alex they thought they knew with the federal agent who had just taken charge of their birthday party. But there would be time for family dynamics later. Right now I had a senator to find and a case to solve. And for the first time in 6 years, I wouldn't have to pretend to be someone I wasn't. The front yard of Grandpa George's house had transformed into something that looked like a scene from a television crime drama. Black SUVs lined Maple Street, their emergency lights casting red and blue patterns across the Victorian facades of the neighboring houses. Neighbors had emerged from their homes, standing on porches and peering through windows, trying to understand why their quiet residential street had suddenly become the center of what was clearly a major law enforcement operation. I approached the lead vehicle, where Director Mitchell was stepping out of the passenger seat. At 52, James Mitchell carried himself with the quiet authority that came from 2 decades in federal law enforcement. His gray hair was perfectly styled despite the urgency of the situation, and his dark suit showed no signs of the frantic drive from Columbus. When he saw me approaching, his expression shifted from operational focus to something that might have been sympathy. "Alex," he said, extending his hand, "I'm sorry we had to compromise your family's situation, but this couldn't wait." "I understand, Director," I replied, shaking his hand and immediately falling into the professional rhythm that had defined our working relationship for the past 3 years. "What's our current status?" Mitchell gestured toward the other vehicles, where agents were emerging and beginning to establish a perimeter around the property. "We've got a full tactical team, forensic specialists, and crisis negotiators. The working theory is that Senator Hawkins was taken against her will, though we can't rule out that she went somewhere voluntarily and then encountered trouble." Agent Lisa Carter approached us, carrying a tablet loaded with case information. Lisa had been my partner on multiple cases over the past 2 years, and her reputation for thoroughness and analytical thinking had made her one of the Bureau's most valued investigators. Her blonde hair was pulled back in the efficient ponytail she favored during active cases, and her expression was focused in the way that meant she had already begun building the mental framework that would guide the investigation. Alex, good to see you, she said, though her tone indicated that any pleasantries would have to wait until after they had resolved the immediate crisis. We've got some concerning developments. The senator's security detail wasn't just found unconscious, they were drugged. Someone with serious pharmaceutical knowledge took them out with a precision that suggests professional training. The implications of this information sent a chill through me. Random kidnappings were one thing, but an operation sophisticated enough to neutralize trained federal security personnel suggested an organization with substantial resources and expertise. This wasn't a crime of opportunity, it was a carefully planned operation that had been in development for weeks or months. Any communication from the kidnappers? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Nothing yet, Mitchell replied. But given the senator's position on the Intelligence Committee and her recent work on counterterrorism legislation, we're treating this as a potential national security issue. If foreign actors are involved, or if this is connected to any of the cases she's been briefed on, the implications go far beyond a simple kidnapping. Behind us, I could hear the sounds of my family's birthday party continuing, though the conversations had taken on a subdued quality. The arrival of multiple federal vehicles and the sudden transformation of their quiet celebration into a crime scene had clearly shaken everyone. I found myself caught between two worlds, responsible for maintaining operational security while also managing the impact on people who had never been exposed to this level of law enforcement activity. What do you need from me? I asked, focusing on the immediate operational requirements. Lisa consulted her tablet, scrolling through information that was being updated in real time. We need to interview everyone who was at this gathering, find out if anyone saw anything unusual in the area during the past 6 hours. We also need to establish whether there's any connection between your family's location and the senator's last known position. The question hung in the air with uncomfortable implications. The idea that my family might be connected to a senator's disappearance, even tangentially, opened up investigative possibilities I didn't want to consider. But I also knew that in cases like this, no coincidence was too small to investigate, no connection too remote to examine. I'll handle the family interviews, I said. They'll be more comfortable talking to me than to strangers, and I know which questions will get us the information we need. Mitchell nodded, but I could see the concern in his eyes. Alex, you understand that you can't let personal relationships compromise the investigation. If we find any connection between your family and the senator's disappearance, we'll have to pursue it regardless of the personal implications. Understood, I replied. Though the thought of investigating my own family members as potential suspects or witnesses in a kidnapping case created a knot of anxiety in my stomach. Professional obligations come first. As we spoke, the tactical team was establishing a command center in the street, setting up communication equipment and coordination systems that would allow them to manage what was clearly going to be a complex, multi-agency investigation. The neighborhood had taken on the atmosphere of a small city under siege, with federal agents moving purposefully through the area and residents watching nervously from their windows. I walked back toward the backyard, where my family was still gathered around Grandpa George's chair, though the celebratory atmosphere had been completely replaced by tension and uncertainty. The string lights that Emma had hung earlier in the day now illuminated a group of people who were struggling to process the rapid transformation of their understanding of both me and their immediate situation. Marcus stood up as I approached, his face showing a combination of confusion and what might have been the beginning of respect. Alex, what exactly is happening here? Are we in danger? The question was reasonable, given the dramatic display of federal law enforcement resources that had suddenly appeared in their neighborhood. From their perspective, the arrival of multiple tactical teams suggested a level of threat that went far beyond their experience or comfort zone. Right now, we don't know, I said honestly. A United States senator has been kidnapped, and her last known location was in this general area. We're treating everyone as potential witnesses, not suspects, but we need to find out if anyone saw anything unusual today. Victoria, who had spent the afternoon making condescending remarks about my lack of career prospects, now looked at me with something approaching awe. "You're actually in charge of this investigation." "I'm the senior agent on scene until additional supervisors arrive," I confirmed. "Which means I need to interview each of you to determine if you have any information that might be relevant to finding the senator." Emma raised her hand tentatively, like a student asking a question in class. "Alex, I saw something earlier that seemed odd. Around 3 o'clock, there was a black sedan that drove past the house 3 times. I noticed it because it was driving really slowly, like the driver was looking for something." The information hit me like an electric shock. 3 o'clock would have been approximately the time that Senator Hawkins had sent her last communication to her security detail. A suspicious vehicle conducting surveillance in the immediate area during that time frame was exactly the kind of detail that could break a case open. "Emma, I need you to think very carefully about this. Can you describe the car in more detail? Did you see the driver? Were there passengers?" She closed her eyes, concentrating on the memory. "It was a newer car, maybe a Camry or Accord. Dark tinted windows, so I couldn't really see inside. But what struck me was how slowly it was moving, like maybe 5 miles per hour, and it kept coming back. I watched it from the kitchen window while I was preparing the salad. I felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came when an investigation began to develop real leads." "Did you notice anything else? License plate, any distinctive features?" "The license plate was from out of state," Emma said, her confidence growing as she realized her information was valuable. "I couldn't read the whole thing, but I remember thinking it was unusual to see an out-of-state car driving around our neighborhood so slowly." Behind me, I heard footsteps approaching and turned to see Agent Carter walking toward our group. Her expression was alert and focused, indicating that she had been monitoring our conversation and understood its significance. "Emma, I'm Agent Carter," Lisa said, introducing herself with the professional courtesy that helped put civilian witnesses at ease. "What you just told your brother could be very important to our investigation. Would you be willing to work with one of our sketch artists to see if we can get a better description of the vehicle?" Emma nodded eagerly, clearly pleased to be contributing something useful to what she was beginning to understand was a major federal investigation. "Of course, anything I can do to help." As Lisa led Emma toward the command center to work with the sketch artist, I turned my attention to the rest of my family. The revelation about the suspicious vehicle had energized the investigation, but it had also raised new questions about why the kidnappers might have been conducting surveillance in this particular neighborhood. "I need each of you to think carefully about today," I said, addressing the group. "Any unusual phone calls, strangers asking questions, vehicles you didn't recognize, anything that seemed out of place. The smallest detail could be important." Cousin David raised his hand. "Actually, now that you mention it, there was something. Around noon, a guy came to the front door asking about whether we'd seen a lost dog. Said it was a golden retriever named Max, and he was really worried about finding it, but something about the conversation felt off." "Off how?" I asked, feeling another piece of the puzzle potentially falling into place. "He was asking specific questions about who lived in the house, how long we'd been here, whether we knew the neighbors well. At the time, I thought he was just being thorough about searching for his dog, but looking back, it felt more like he was gathering information about the neighborhood." Agent Carter had returned from setting up Emma's session with the sketch artist, and she was taking notes on everything the family was telling me. The pattern that was emerging suggested a sophisticated reconnaissance operation, the kind of advanced preparation that indicated professional criminals with significant resources and planning capabilities. "Can you describe this person?" Lisa asked David. "Mid-30s, average height, brown hair, wearing jeans and a polo shirt, nothing distinctive, but he had this way of asking questions that felt like an interrogation, even though he was supposedly just looking for a lost dog." My phone buzzed with a text message from Director Mitchell. "Forensics team found evidence of struggle at Senator's last known location, also found traces of the same pharmaceutical compound used on her security detail. This is definitely professional." I looked up from my phone to find my family watching me with expressions of concern and curiosity. The reality of their situation was beginning to sink in. They had been unwitting witnesses to the preliminary stages of a kidnapping operation that had targeted one of the most powerful people in the federal government. "What is it?" Marcus asked, and for the first time since I had known him, his voice carried none of his usual condescension or assumption of superiority. "The investigation is developing rapidly," I said carefully. "What you've told us about the suspicious vehicle and the person asking about a lost dog could be directly connected to the senator's disappearance." The implications of this statement settled over the group like a weight. These were people who lived comfortable, predictable lives in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The idea that their peaceful community had been used as a staging area for a major federal crime was foreign to their experience and deeply unsettling. Grandpa George, who had been listening quietly to the conversation swirling around him, spoke up for the first time since the agents had arrived. "Alex, in all the years I've known you, I never imagined you were dealing with things like this. How do you handle the stress? How do you sleep at night, knowing there are people out there planning these kinds of operations?" The question was deeper than simple curiosity. I could hear the respect in his voice, the recognition that the work I did required a level of courage and commitment that he was only beginning to understand. For 6 years, I had let him believe I was drifting through life without purpose, when in reality I had been engaged in some of the most important and dangerous work in federal law enforcement. "You learn to compartmentalize," I said honestly. "You focus on the cases you can solve, the people you can help, the threats you can neutralize. And you remember that there are good people in the world who deserve to live in safety, even if they never know what it costs to maintain that safety." Victoria, who had spent the day making subtle jokes about my lack of achievement, looked like she was reconsidering every assumption she had ever made about my life and character. "Alex, I owe you an apology. The things I said earlier, the way I talked about your career, I had no idea what you were actually doing." "You couldn't have known," I replied, though I couldn't completely hide my satisfaction at seeing her discomfort. "The nature of my work requires that most people, including family, don't understand what I do or why it matters." My phone rang again, and I recognized the urgent tone that indicated a major development. "Thompson here, Alex, we've got a break." Director Mitchell's voice was charged with the energy that came with significant progress on a case. "The pharmaceutical compound used on the senator's security detail is specialized, only available through certain medical supply channels. We've identified 3 possible sources in Ohio, and one of them is less than 10 miles from your current location." The proximity was too close to be coincidental. If the kidnappers had obtained their drugs from a supplier near my family's neighborhood, it suggested that they had chosen this area for the operation based on logistics and access to resources, not random chance. "What do you need from me?" I asked, already knowing that the investigation was about to shift into a more active phase. "We're preparing to raid the medical supply facility, but we need local intelligence about the area. Can you coordinate with your family to find out if anyone has noticed unusual activity around the medical buildings on Route 42? Route 42 was a commercial strip about 6 miles from Grandpa's house, an area that included several medical offices, a small hospital, and various support businesses that served the healthcare industry. If the kidnappers had been using that area as a base of operations, my family might have additional information that could help the tactical team plan their approach." I ended the call and looked around at my family, who were waiting for information about what would happen next. The birthday party that had begun with Marcus calling me worthless was now the center of a federal investigation that could have national security implications. "I need to ask you about the medical facilities on Route 42, I said. "Have any of you noticed unusual activity in that area recently? Vehicles coming and going at odd hours, people who seemed out of place, anything that caught your attention?" My mother, who had been quiet through most of the evening's revelations, suddenly straightened in her chair. "Actually, Linda and I were just talking about that yesterday," she said, referring to our neighbor Linda Patterson. "There's been a lot of activity at that new medical supply place, the one that opened about 6 months ago. Trucks coming and going at all hours, people in suits who didn't look like they belonged in a medical facility." Agent Carter looked up from her notes with interest. "Can you be more specific about what seemed out of place?" The trucks were unmarked, which seemed odd for a medical supply company, my mother continued. And the people in suits, they had this intensity about them, like they were conducting serious business rather than just delivering medical supplies. Linda mentioned it to me because she thought they might be doing something that wasn't entirely legal. The information was potentially explosive. If the medical supply facility was being used as a front for criminal operations, it could explain how the kidnappers had obtained the specialized pharmaceuticals used in the senator's abduction. It could also mean that the facility was being used as a staging area or safe house for the operation. My phone buzzed again with another message from Director Mitchell, tactical team moving on medical facility in 20 minutes. Need you to coordinate local support and maintain security at family location in case kidnappers return to area. I looked around at my family, who were watching me with expressions that ranged from admiration to concern to complete bewilderment. The comfortable assumptions that had governed their understanding of my life had been completely shattered, and they were still struggling to process the new reality. What happens now? Emma asked, voicing the question that was clearly on everyone's mind. Now we find the senator and bring her home safely, I said, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with cases that had national implications. And we make sure that the people who took her understand that attacking American officials comes with consequences they won't survive. The determination in my voice seemed to resonate with my family, and I could see their fear beginning to transform into something that looked like pride. For the first time in 6 years, they were seeing me not as the family disappointment, but as someone who stood between them and dangers they had never imagined. Marcus, who had spent the day lecturing me about responsibility and achievement, looked like he was reconsidering every interaction we had ever had. Alex, I don't know what to say. The things I said about you being worthless, about not contributing anything meaningful, I was completely wrong. You didn't know, I said, though I couldn't hide my satisfaction at finally being recognized for who I really was, but now you do. And now you understand why some contributions can't be measured by the standards you're used to using. The sound of helicopters began to fill the air above us, and I knew that the tactical phase of the operation was beginning. Somewhere in the darkness, federal agents were preparing to storm a medical facility that might hold the key to finding Senator Hawkins. And here, in my grandfather's backyard, my family was finally learning the truth about the man they had underestimated for so many years. The birthday party was officially over, the real work was just beginning. The helicopters circled overhead like mechanical vultures, their searchlights cutting through the darkness as the tactical team prepared for the raid on the medical supply facility. I stood in Grandpa George's backyard, coordinating between the command center that had been established in the street and my family members who had become crucial witnesses in a case that was rapidly escalating beyond anything I had handled in my 6 years with the Bureau. Agent Carter approached me with her tablet, her expression grim. Alex, we've got confirmation from surveillance that there's unusual heat signatures in the basement of the medical facility. Could be people being held against their will, could be sophisticated equipment, but either way, it's not what you'd expect from a legitimate medical supply company. The implications were clear. If Senator Hawkins was being held in that facility, time was running out. Kidnapping cases had a critical window, and every hour that passed reduced the likelihood of a successful rescue. But the sophistication of the operation suggested that we weren't dealing with amateur criminals, which meant the tactical approach had to be perfect. What's the entry plan? I asked, shifting fully into operational mode, despite the surreal circumstances of coordinating a federal raid from my grandfather's birthday party. Director Mitchell is leading a 3-team approach, Lisa explained. Simultaneous entry from multiple points to prevent the suspects from harming hostages or destroying evidence, but we're concerned about potential booby traps or security measures that could complicate the operation. Behind us, my family had gathered around the patio table, their voices low as they discussed the evening's revelations. The transformation in their demeanor was remarkable. Marcus, who had started the day by calling me worthless and lazy, now looked at me with something approaching reverence. Victoria had completely abandoned her condescending attitude, replaced by a nervous Due for work. But because of how you've handled tonight, you've protected this family while doing your job, and that takes a special kind of strength." The words hit me harder than I expected. For 6 years, I had endured subtle and not so subtle criticism from family members who couldn't understand my choices, who saw my life as a series of missed opportunities and failed potential. To finally receive recognition from the person whose opinion mattered most to me was emotionally overwhelming. "Thank you, Grandpa," I said, feeling a tightness in my throat that I hadn't experienced since childhood. "That means more to me than you know." My radio crackled with communication from the tactical team. "All units, we have visual confirmation of the target facility. Multiple vehicles in the parking area, including a black sedan, matching the description provided by witness Thompson. Beginning approach now." Emma looked up at me with excitement. "That's the car I saw. The one that kept driving past the house." The confirmation that her observation had been accurate gave me a surge of professional satisfaction. In cases like this, success often depended on seemingly minor details provided by observant civilians. Emma's attention to the suspicious vehicle had directly contributed to identifying the kidnapper's base of operations. "Outstanding work," I told her, and I could see her confidence growing as she realized that her contribution had been genuinely important to the investigation. The radio chattered with updates from the tactical team as they positioned themselves around the medical facility. I could visualize the operation based on my training and experience: agents moving through the darkness with military precision, thermal imaging equipment scanning for heat signatures, communications specialists maintaining contact between teams, and crisis negotiators preparing for potential hostage situations. "Breacher teams in position," came the next update. "No visible security at the perimeter, but heat signatures suggest at least 6 individuals in the basement area." 6 people in a basement that should have been empty was significant. It could mean multiple kidnappers, multiple hostages, or a combination of both. The tactical teams would have to assume the worst-case scenario and prepare for armed resistance. Marcus approached me hesitantly, his earlier arrogance completely replaced by uncertainty and what looked like genuine remorse. "Alex, I need to apologize for everything I said today. I had no idea what you were actually doing with your life, and I said some terrible things based on completely wrong assumptions." Looking at him, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Part of me wanted to savor his discomfort, to make him fully understand how wrong he had been about my life and contributions. But another part of me recognized that his apology was genuine, and that holding grudges wouldn't help anyone. "Marcus, you couldn't have known," I said, extending more grace than he probably deserved. "My work requires secrecy, which means people make assumptions based on incomplete information. The important thing is that you understand now." Victoria stepped forward, her perfectly styled appearance now somewhat disheveled by the stress of the evening's events. "Alex, I owe you an apology too. The comments I made about your career, the suggestions that you weren't contributing anything meaningful, I was completely out of line." "We all were," my mother added, her voice carrying the weight of parental guilt. "We should have trusted that you knew what you were doing, should have given you credit for making choices we didn't understand." The family reconciliation was interrupted by urgent radio traffic from the tactical team. "Control, we have movement in the basement. Looks like they're aware of our presence and may be preparing to move the hostages." The situation had just become exponentially more dangerous. If the kidnappers knew they were being raided, they might decide that eliminating evidence, including human witnesses, was preferable to capture. The tactical teams would have to accelerate their timeline and accept higher levels of risk to prevent harm to any hostages. "All teams execute entry now," came Director Mitchell's voice over the radio. "Priority 1 is hostage safety, Priority 2 is suspect apprehension." I found myself holding my breath as I listened to the radio chatter that would determine whether this case ended in successful rescue or tragedy. My family gathered around me, instinctively understanding that we were witnessing a critical moment in an operation that had national security implications. Basement secured, came the first report. We have one hostage, female, appears to be Senator Hawkins. She's alive but sedated. Medical team requested immediately. The relief that washed over me was profound. Senator Hawkins was alive, which meant the case could be considered a success, regardless of what else happened. But the radio traffic indicated that the operation was still ongoing. 4 suspects in custody, came the next update. 2 additional suspects barricaded in the main office area, not responding to negotiation attempts. Agent Carter looked up from her communication equipment with concern. The barricaded suspects could have intelligence about other operations or additional threats. We need them alive if possible. The complexity of federal law enforcement was something my family had never been exposed to. They lived in a world where problems had clear solutions, where good guys and bad guys were easily identified, where justice was straightforward and immediate. The reality was far more nuanced, involving considerations about intelligence value, ongoing investigations, and potential connections to larger criminal enterprises. Flashbang deployed in office area, came the radio report. Moving in now, the concussion grenades used by tactical teams were designed to disorient suspects without causing permanent harm, but they were also incredibly disorienting to anyone in the vicinity. I could only imagine what Senator Hawkins was experiencing as she regained consciousness in the middle of a federal raid. Office secured, 2 additional suspects in custody, came the final tactical update. All hostiles neutralized, no law enforcement injuries, hostage in stable condition, and being transported to medical facility for evaluation. The successful conclusion of the raid sent a wave of relief through my family that was almost palpable. They had been witnessing something far outside their normal experience, and the knowledge that it had ended without tragedy allowed them to begin processing what they had learned about my life and work. Director Mitchell's voice came through on my direct line. "Alex, outstanding work on the intelligence gathering. The information your family provided was crucial to the success of this operation. Senator Hawkins is going to make a full recovery, and we've got 6 suspects who are going to provide us with intelligence about a much larger operation." The praise felt good, but it also reminded me of the ongoing nature of this work. Tonight's success was significant, but it was also just one case among many, one threat neutralized among dozens that remained active. The work would continue tomorrow, and the day after that, and for as long as people like me were willing to stand between civilians and the dangers they never knew existed. I ended the call and turned to face my family, who were looking at me with expressions I had never seen before. The condescension was gone, replaced by respect. The disappointment had been replaced by pride. The assumptions about my failures had been replaced by understanding of my contributions. "So," Grandpa George said with a smile that contained decades of wisdom and love, "I guess this means we're going to have to get used to the idea that our Alex isn't the family disappointment after all." Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it, only embarrassment and genuine regret. Disappointment? Alex just helped rescue a United States senator from kidnappers. I spent the day calling him worthless while he was literally protecting national security. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. While Marcus had been lecturing me about responsibility and contribution, I had been working a case that involved threats to one of the most powerful people in the federal government. While Victoria had been making jokes about my lack of career prospects, I had been coordinating with FBI directors and tactical teams. While my parents had been worrying about my future, I had been building a career that had direct impact on the safety and security of millions of Americans. "The thing is," I said, looking around at my family, "this is what I do every day. Not always at this level of intensity, not always with senators and national security implications, but this is my job. Protecting people who don't know they need protection, solving problems before they become crises, standing between good people and very bad people who want to hurt them." Emma wiped tears from her eyes. "Alex, I'm so sorry we didn't understand. I'm sorry we didn't support you the way we should have." "You couldn't support what you didn't know about," I replied, "but now you do know, and that changes everything." Agent Carter approached our group, her tablet tucked under her arm, and a satisfied expression on her face. Alex, the suspects are talking. This wasn't just about Senator Hawkins, it was part of a larger operation targeting multiple government officials. Your work tonight probably prevented additional kidnappings and potentially saved lives beyond just the senator. The scope of what we had disrupted was beginning to become clear. This hadn't been an isolated incident, but part of a coordinated attack on American government officials. The intelligence my family had provided, combined with the rapid response of the federal law enforcement community, had disrupted what could have been a national security disaster. "What happens now?" my father asked, and I could hear the genuine interest in his voice, the desire to understand my world rather than dismiss it. "Now we process the suspects, analyze the intelligence we've gathered, and continue investigating the larger network these people were part of," I explained. "This case is closed, but it's also the beginning of potentially dozens of other cases." The complexity of federal law enforcement was something they had never considered. Each successful operation generated new leads, new questions, new threats to investigate. It was work that never truly ended, but it was also work that made a measurable difference in the safety and security of the country. My phone buzzed with a text message from Director Mitchell. "Excellent work tonight, Alex. Senator Hawkins specifically asked me to thank you and your family for the intelligence that made tonight's rescue possible. She wants to meet with you personally when she's released from the hospital." I showed the message to my family, who read it with expressions of amazement. The idea that a United States senator wanted to personally thank them for their contribution to her rescue was beyond anything they had ever imagined possible. "She wants to thank us," my mother asked, her voice filled with wonder, "but we just told you what we saw." "What you saw was crucial intelligence that directly led to her rescue," I explained. "Without Emma's observation about the suspicious vehicle, without David's information about the person asking questions, without Mom's intelligence about unusual activity at the medical facility, we might not have found her in time." The recognition that their contributions had been genuinely important was transforming their understanding not just of my work, but of their own capacity to make a difference. They were beginning to understand that citizenship sometimes required more than just following laws and paying taxes, that protecting democracy sometimes depended on ordinary people being observant and willing to get involved. As the tactical teams began to withdraw, and the neighborhood started to return to something approaching normal, my family gathered around the patio table where Grandpa George's birthday cake still sat, largely untouched. The celebration had been interrupted by federal law enforcement operations, but the underlying purpose of the gathering, honoring a man who had lived 7.5 decades with dignity and purpose, remained valid. "You know what I think?" Grandpa said, looking around at his family with satisfaction. "I think this has been the most interesting birthday party I've ever had. I got to see my grandson save a senator and discover that the family disappointment is actually the family hero." Marcus winced at the reference to calling me the family disappointment, but he also nodded in agreement. "Alex, I don't know how to make up for the things I said today. I called you worthless and lazy and a burden, and it turns out you're literally saving lives and protecting national security. You make up for it by understanding that worth isn't always visible," I said. "Some of the most important work in the world is done by people nobody ever hears about, people who can't talk about what they do or get recognition for their contributions. That doesn't make their work less valuable." Victoria, who had spent the day making cutting remarks about my lack of achievements, looked genuinely ashamed. "Alex, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you respect, and recognition, and support for work that I clearly didn't understand." The reconciliation felt genuine, but it also felt incomplete. 6 years of condescension and dismissal couldn't be erased by one evening of revelation, no matter how dramatic, but it was a beginning, a foundation for a different kind of relationship built on truth, rather than assumptions. Agent Carter began packing up her equipment, the investigation phase of the evening winding down as the case transitioned to prosecution and follow-up investigations. "Alex, you should know that this case is going to generate significant recognition within the Bureau. Your intelligence gathering and family coordination probably saved lives tonight." The praise was gratifying, but it also reminded me of the ongoing nature of this work. Tomorrow there would be other cases, other threats, other situations requiring the same level of commitment and secrecy that had defined my career for the past 6 years. What does this mean for your cover with the family? Lisa asked quietly. Now that they know the truth about your work, how does that change your operational security? It was a good question, one that I would need to discuss with Director Mitchell and the security specialists. My family's knowledge of my real career created new considerations for case management and personal security, but it also created opportunities for better support and understanding of the demands my work placed on personal relationships. We'll figure it out, I said. Right now I'm just glad they finally know the truth. As the federal vehicles began to leave the neighborhood and Maple Street started to return to its normal quiet suburban character, my family gathered around me with expressions that mixed exhaustion, amazement, and what looked like genuine pride. So, Emma said with a smile that reminded me why she had always been my favorite sibling, I guess this means family dinners are going to be a lot more interesting from now on. Marcus laughed, and for the first time in years, there was no condescension in the sound. I think that's the understatement of the century. Our brother just coordinated the rescue of a United States senator from his grandfather's birthday party. The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on anyone. What had started as a routine family gathering had become the coordination point for a major federal investigation, and the family member they had all written off as a failure had turned out to be the one protecting them from dangers they had never imagined. You know what I learned tonight, Grandpa George said, cutting himself a piece of birthday cake that had waited patiently through an evening of revelations and reconciliations. I learned that the most important heroes are often the ones standing right next to us, doing work we don't understand, protecting us in ways we can't see. He looked directly at me as he spoke, and I could see the pride in his eyes, the recognition that transcended career achievements or visible success. I also learned, he continued, that family means supporting each other even when we don't understand each other's choices. And that sometimes the person you think needs the most help is actually the one helping everyone else. The lesson wasn't lost on Marcus, who looked like he was reconsidering every assumption he had ever made about success, contribution, and worth. Alex, I don't know what to say, except that I was wrong about everything, about your choices, about your contributions, about your value to this family and to the world. You weren't wrong to want me to be successful, I replied. You were wrong about how to measure success. As the evening wound down and family members began to head home, I found myself standing in Grandpa's backyard, with a profound sense of completion. For 6 years, I had lived a divided life, keeping my professional world separate from my personal relationships. Tonight, those worlds had collided in the most dramatic way possible, and the result had been not just the successful resolution of a major case, but the healing of family relationships that had been strained by misunderstanding and miscommunication. Emma was the last to leave, giving me a hug that conveyed everything she couldn't put into words. I'm proud of you, Alex. I'm proud of who you are, and what you do, and I'm sorry it took a kidnapped senator for the rest of us to figure it out. As I helped Grandpa clean up the remnants of his interrupted birthday party, he looked at me with satisfaction and something that might have been wisdom. You know, Alex, he said, today turned out to be the perfect birthday after all. I got to see my family come together, I learned that my grandson is a hero, and I got to witness history being made in my own backyard. Not many people can say their 75th birthday party helped rescue a United States senator. I smiled, feeling a contentment I hadn't experienced in years. Happy birthday, Grandpa. I'm sorry it wasn't the quiet celebration you were expecting. He laughed, the sound carrying decades of joy and wisdom. Quiet celebrations are overrated. Tonight was an adventure, and at my age, adventures are precious gifts. As I drove home that night, I reflected on the profound changes that had taken place in a single evening. My family finally knew the truth about my work. A senator had been rescued, a major criminal operation had been disrupted, and relationships that had been strained by misunderstanding had been healed by truth. Tomorrow there would be other cases, other challenges, other opportunities to stand between good people and those who wanted to harm them. But tonight, for the first time in 6 years, I wouldn't have to carry that burden alone. My family finally understood who I was and what I did, and that understanding would make all the difference in the world. The family disappointment had become the family hero, and the worthless burden had revealed himself to be the one carrying the weight of protecting everyone he loved. 3 months after Grandpa George's 75th birthday party became the coordination center for a federal kidnapping investigation, I found myself sitting in a private dining room at the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., sharing lunch with Senator Patricia Hawkins. The woman who had been unconscious and sedated when federal agents carried her out of that medical supply facility basement, was now fully recovered, articulate, and determined to express her gratitude in ways that went far beyond the simple thank you note most people might have expected. Senator Hawkins was smaller in person than she appeared on television, but her presence filled the room with an intensity that explained how she had risen to become one of the most influential members of the Senate Intelligence Committee. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, her navy blue suit was impeccably tailored, and her eyes held the sharp intelligence that had made her both respected and feared in political circles. But when she looked at me across the mahogany table, her expression was warm with genuine appreciation. "Agent Thompson," she said, raising her water glass in an informal toast, "I've read the complete case file, and I want you to understand that your family's observations quite literally saved my life. Without their intelligence, the Bureau might have spent crucial hours searching in the wrong areas while my kidnappers moved me to a secondary location or worse." The praise felt good, but it also reminded me of how dramatically my family dynamics had changed in the months since that evening. The revelation of my true career had created ripple effects that were still playing out in unexpected ways. Marcus had gone from treating me like the family disappointment to seeking my advice on everything from business security to personal safety. Victoria had completely abandoned her condescending attitude, replaced by a nervous respect that sometimes made family gatherings awkward in entirely new ways. "Senator, my family was just being observant citizens," I replied, though I knew the modesty was somewhat false. The intelligence they had provided had indeed been crucial, and their willingness to cooperate fully with the investigation had accelerated the timeline that ultimately led to her rescue. Observant citizens who happened to be related to a federal agent who knew how to coordinate their information into actionable intelligence, she corrected with a smile. "Don't undersell your role in this, Alex. May I call you Alex?" I nodded, still adjusting to the surreal experience of having a United States Senator use my first name and treat me as a peer rather than just another federal employee. The case had generated recognition within the Bureau that had accelerated my career trajectory in ways I was still processing. "The reason I wanted to meet with you personally," Senator Hawkins continued, "is that this case opened my eyes to gaps in how we approach domestic security threats. The sophistication of the operation that targeted me suggests that hostile actors are becoming more aggressive in their tactics against American officials." She leaned forward, her expression becoming more serious. "I'm proposing legislation that would expand funding for the kind of task force work you do, with particular emphasis on protecting the families of federal agents who are engaged in sensitive operations. Your family became unwitting participants in a major investigation, and that experience highlighted vulnerabilities we need to address." The implications were significant. If Senator Hawkins was successful in her legislative efforts, it could mean expanded resources, better protection for agents' families, and recognition for the kind of work that had traditionally been invisible to the public and to Congress. "That's very generous, Senator," I said, "but I hope you understand that most agents prefer to keep their work separate from their personal lives. The secrecy isn't just operational security, it's also protection for people who didn't choose this career." "I understand completely," she replied. "But your case also demonstrated that sometimes those worlds collide whether we want them to or not. When that happens, families need support systems and resources that currently don't exist." The conversation was interrupted by her aide, who quietly informed her that she had another meeting in 15 minutes. Senator Hawkins nodded, but continued our discussion with the focused intensity that characterized her approach to important issues. "Alex, I also wanted you to know that the intelligence gathered from this case has led to the disruption of 3 additional operations targeting government officials. The network we uncovered was far more extensive than anyone initially realized. This was news to me, though it wasn't entirely surprising. Major cases often generated leads that took months to develop, and the sophistication of the original operation had suggested connections to larger criminal enterprises. Are you able to share any details about the scope of what was disrupted? I asked, knowing that much of the information would likely be classified above my clearance level. What I can tell you is that your work that night prevented what could have been a coordinated attack on multiple senators and representatives. The medical supply facility was just one node in a network that had been planning simultaneous operations across 3 states. The scope was staggering. What I had initially understood as a single kidnapping case had actually been part of a domestic terrorism operation with national implications. The birthday party that had seemed like the most inconvenient timing possible for a federal investigation had actually represented perfect timing that had prevented a potential catastrophe. As lunch concluded and Senator Hawkins prepared for her next meeting, she handed me a business card with her direct contact information. "Alex, I want you to stay in touch. The work you're doing matters more than you probably realize, and I want to make sure that people like you have the support and resources you need to keep doing it." Walking out of the Capitol building and down the steps where so much American history had been made, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since that summer evening in Millfield, Ohio. The recognition was gratifying, but it also came with new responsibilities and expectations that I was still learning to navigate. My phone buzzed with a text message from Emma. "How did lunch with the senator go? Mom wants to know if you're going to be on the news again." The reference to being on the news brought back memories I was still processing. 2 weeks after the rescue operation, a journalist had somehow obtained enough information about the case to write a feature story about the neighborhood heroes who had provided crucial intelligence. The article had been tactfully written, focusing more on civic engagement than operational details, but it had still resulted in uncomfortable attention for my family. Marcus had been quoted in the article expressing pride in his brother's career and regret about his earlier failure to understand the importance of federal law enforcement work. The quotes had been genuine, but they had also been awkward, representing such a complete reversal of his previous attitude that some readers had commented skeptically about their authenticity. I texted Emma back, "Went well. Senator is working on legislation to support families of federal agents. Tell Mom no TV appearances planned." The response came immediately, "Too bad, she's been practicing her interview answers just in case." The image of my mother rehearsing television interviews about her son's heroic career was both touching and mortifying. The recognition was something she had craved for years, validation that her son wasn't the failure she had sometimes worried he might become, but the attention also created security concerns that required ongoing management. Driving back toward Ohio, I thought about the family dinner that was planned for the following weekend. These gatherings had taken on a completely different character since the revelation of my real career. Instead of enduring subtle criticism about my life choices, I now found myself fielding questions about casework that I usually couldn't discuss, career advice requests from relatives who had never shown interest in my opinions before, and expressions of pride that sometimes felt as overwhelming as the previous dismissiveness had been. My phone rang as I merged onto Interstate 270, and I recognized Marcus's number. Over the past 3 months, my brother had been calling me regularly, a development that would have been unthinkable before the birthday party incident. "Alex, I hope I'm not interrupting anything important," Marcus said, his tone carrying the deference that had replaced his previous condescension. "Just driving back from Washington. What's going on?" "I wanted to run something by you. Victoria and I have been talking about security for the restaurants, especially given some of the things we've learned about organized crime targeting small businesses. Do you think it would be worth hiring a security consultant?" The question was reasonable, but it also represented the kind of overcorrection that had characterized much of my family's response to learning about my career. The discovery that I worked in federal law enforcement had made them hyper-aware of potential threats that had never concerned them before. "Marcus, the likelihood of your restaurants being targeted by organized crime is extremely low," I said, trying to provide perspective without dismissing his concerns. "But if it would give you peace of mind, a basic security assessment wouldn't hurt. Could you recommend someone?" I'd rather work with people you trust than just hire someone random. The request was flattering, but it also highlighted how my family's perception of my expertise had swung from one extreme to another. Before, they had assumed I knew nothing about anything important. Now they sometimes seem to think I was an authority on every aspect of law enforcement and security. I'll send you some names of reputable firms in the Columbus area, I promised. But remember, most small businesses operate for decades without any security issues beyond ordinary theft prevention. After ending the call, I reflected on how the revelation of my career had affected each family member differently. Emma had embraced the new information with enthusiasm, asking thoughtful questions about my work and expressing genuine interest in law enforcement career paths. My parents had responded with a mixture of pride and worry, pleased to finally understand my career but concerned about dangers they had never previously considered. Victoria's transformation had been the most dramatic. The woman who had spent years making subtle remarks about my lack of achievement now treated me with a respect that sometimes bordered on reverence. She had also become something of a local celebrity, frequently mentioned in social media posts about the heroic family that had helped rescue a senator, but it was Grandpa George whose response had meant the most to me. In the months since his birthday party, he had become my closest confidant within the family, the person who best understood the balance between public service and personal sacrifice that characterized my career. His pride was quiet but unmistakable, and his support had helped me navigate the adjustments that came with no longer maintaining separate personal and professional identities. Arriving back in Millfield as the sun began to set, I drove past the medical supply facility that had been the center of the kidnapping operation. The building was empty now, surrounded by crime scene tape that fluttered in the evening breeze like yellow ribbons marking a memorial. The investigation had revealed that the facility had been used for money laundering and drug distribution in addition to serving as a base for the kidnapping operation, making it a multi-jurisdictional case that would generate prosecutions for years to come. The neighborhood around Grandpa's house had returned to its normal quiet suburban character, though I sometimes caught neighbors looking at me with expressions of curiosity and respect. The street where I had grown up was now associated with national news stories and federal investigations, a development that had created a mixture of pride and discomfort among residents who valued their privacy and peaceful lifestyle. Pulling into my own driveway, I found myself thinking about the upcoming family dinner and the continuing process of adjusting to my new reality within the Thompson family dynamic. The condescension was gone, replaced by respect and sometimes excessive admiration. But the relationships were still finding their new equilibrium, still learning how to function now that everyone understood who I really was and what I actually did for a living. My phone buzzed with a message from Director Mitchell. "Alex, excellent work on the Hawkins case follow-up interviews. Senator's office has requested that you be assigned as liaison for the new legislation she's proposing." Interested, the opportunity was significant, potentially career-defining. Working directly with Senator Hawkins on legislation related to federal law enforcement would provide visibility and influence that could accelerate my advancement within the Bureau. But it would also mean more public exposure, more attention, and further complications for the family privacy I had spent years protecting. I typed back, very interested. "When do we discuss details?" The response came immediately. "Monday morning, my office. This could be big for you, Alex." Looking up at the house where I had lived quietly for the past several years, maintaining the fiction that I was just another government employee with an unremarkable career, I realized that those days were definitively over. The revelation of my true work had set in motion changes that extended far beyond my immediate family, creating opportunities and challenges that I was still learning to navigate. But as I thought about Senator Hawkins' words over lunch, about the legislation she was proposing and the recognition she was seeking for the work that agents like me did every day, I felt a sense of purpose that went beyond personal advancement. The case that had started with my brother calling me worthless had evolved into an opportunity to advocate for resources and support that could help other agents and their families. The irony wasn't lost on me. Marcus's cruel words at the birthday party had set in motion events that would ultimately lead to national recognition for the work he had dismissed as valueless. The brother he had called a burden was now being consulted by United States senators about policy that could affect domestic security for years to come. My phone rang again, and this time it was Emma calling. "Alex, are you coming to dinner on Sunday? Grandpa specifically asked me to make sure you'll be there. He says he has something important to discuss with the family." "Of course I'll be there," I said, though I found myself wondering what Grandpa George might have planned. At 75, he had developed a tendency toward dramatic gestures and meaningful announcements that kept the family guessing about his intentions. "Good, and Alex, I wanted you to know that I've been thinking about what you do, about the sacrifices you make to keep people safe. I'm proud of you, and I'm sorry it took so long for all of us to understand." The sentiment was heartfelt, but it also reminded me of the ongoing process of adjustment that my entire family was still navigating. Learning the truth about my career had forced them to reconsider assumptions they had held for years, and that reconsideration was still ongoing. "Emma, you don't need to apologize. The important thing is that we understand each other now." "I know, but I also want you to know that if you ever need support, or if your work creates problems for you, we're here. We understand now that what you do matters, and we want to help however we can." The offer was touching, but it also highlighted one of the challenges of my new reality. My family's desire to support my career was genuine, but their understanding of what that support should look like was still developing. They sometimes offered help with problems I didn't have, or worried about dangers that weren't actually threatening. After ending the call, I sat in my car for a few more minutes, processing the day's events and preparing for the evening ahead. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new challenges, and new opportunities to protect people who would never know my name or understand the work that went into keeping them safe. But tonight I would enjoy the knowledge that for the first time in my adult life, my family understood who I was and what I did. The worthless burden had become the family hero, the disappointment had become a source of pride, and the brother who had been dismissed as a failure was now someone whose opinions were sought and whose achievements were celebrated. The recognition felt good, but it also carried responsibility. My family's pride in my work was gratifying, but it also created expectations and obligations that extended beyond my professional duties. I was no longer just Agent Thompson of the FBI, I was also Alex Thompson, the family member whose career had brought both honor and complexity to the people he loved most. As I finally walked toward my front door, I thought about the dinner conversation I would have with Senator Hawkins' proposed legislation, about the meeting with Director Mitchell on Monday morning, and about the family gathering on Sunday, where Grandpa George had something important to announce. The quiet suburban life I had maintained for years was definitively over, replaced by recognition, opportunity, and the ongoing challenge of balancing public service with personal relationships. But as I looked back toward the street where I had grown up, where a United States Senator had been rescued from my grandfather's birthday party, I felt a deep satisfaction with the path my life had taken. Marcus had called me worthless, but the FBI director now sought my counsel. Victoria had dismissed my career as meaningless, but a senator was proposing legislation based on my work. My family had questioned my contributions, but those contributions had quite literally helped save lives and protect national security. The transformation was complete, but the story was still being written. Tomorrow would bring new chapters, new challenges, and new opportunities to prove that worth isn't always visible, that heroes don't always get recognition, and that sometimes the most important work is done by people whose names never appear in headlines. But tonight, I was simply Alex Thompson, federal agent, family hero, and living proof that assumptions about worth and value can be dangerously wrong. Sunday arrived with the crisp clarity that only October in Ohio could provide. The maple trees lining Grandpa George's street had transformed into a symphony of gold and crimson, creating the perfect backdrop for what I suspected would be another memorable family gathering. As I pulled into the familiar driveway, I noticed more cars than usual parked along the street, suggesting that Grandpa's mysterious announcement had drawn a larger crowd than typical Sunday dinners usually attracted. Emma greeted me at the front door with an expression that mixed excitement with curiosity. "Alex, I think Grandpa's been planning something big. He's been making phone calls all week, and yesterday a delivery truck brought several boxes that he wouldn't let anyone see." The mystery was intriguing, but it was also characteristic of Grandpa George's approach to family gatherings. At 75, he had developed a flair for dramatic timing and meaningful gestures that kept everyone guessing about his intentions until the moment he was ready to reveal them. Inside, I found the house filled with relatives I hadn't seen since the birthday party 3 months earlier. Cousin David was deep in conversation with my father about restaurant security measures, a topic that had become surprisingly popular among family members since they had learned about my career. Aunt Margaret was showing photos on her phone to a group of women, and I caught fragments of conversation about our family's hero and the senator rescue. The attention was flattering but also overwhelming. Before the birthday party incident, family gatherings had been exercises in enduring subtle criticism about my life choices. Now they often felt like informal press conferences where I was expected to share insights about law enforcement work that I usually couldn't discuss in detail. Marcus approached me with his now familiar expression of respect mixed with lingering embarrassment. "Alex, I'm glad you could make it. Grandpa's been asking about you all week, making sure you'd be here for whatever he has planned." The relationship between Marcus and me was still finding its new equilibrium. 3 months wasn't enough time to completely erase 6 years of condescension and dismissal, but his efforts to rebuild our connection had been genuine and persistent. He had even started asking for my advice about business decisions, treating my opinions with a deference that sometimes made our interactions awkward. "Any idea what this is about?" I asked, scanning the room for clues about Grandpa's mysterious announcement. "No clue," Marcus replied. "But he's been in an unusually good mood all week, like he's planning something that's going to make everyone happy." Victoria joined our conversation, her transformation from condescending sister-in-law to respectful ally, still striking after all these months. "Alex, I wanted you to know that Jake has been telling his friends at school about his uncle, the FBI agent. You've become something of a legend in his social circle." The information was both touching and concerning. My 16-year-old nephew's pride in my career was gratifying, but it also represented the kind of public exposure that created security considerations I was still learning to manage. The balance between family pride and operational security was an ongoing challenge that required constant attention. Before I could respond, Grandpa George's voice carried across the room from his favorite armchair, calling for everyone's attention. The conversations gradually quieted as family members gathered in the living room, arranging themselves in the informal semicircle that had become traditional for his announcements. "Thank you all for coming today," he began, his voice carrying the authority that came from decades of being the family patriarch. "I know I've been mysterious about why I wanted everyone here, but I think you'll understand once I explain what I've been working on." He gestured toward Emma, who disappeared into the kitchen and returned carrying one of the mysterious boxes that had been delivered during the week. The anticipation in the room was palpable as she set the box on the coffee table in front of his chair. 3 months ago, this family experienced something extraordinary, Grandpa continued, his eyes moving around the room to make contact with each person present. "We learned that someone we had underestimated, someone we had failed to fully appreciate, was actually protecting all of us in ways we never understood." His gaze settled on me, and I felt the familiar mixture of pride and discomfort that came with being the center of family attention. The recognition was gratifying, but it also felt excessive given that I had simply been doing my job. "But more than that," he continued, "we learned that heroism often exists right beside us, invisible and unrecognized, carried out by people who ask for nothing in return except the knowledge that they're making a difference." Emma opened the box and began removing items that made my breath catch in my throat. Framed photographs, certificates, newspaper clippings, and what appeared to be official correspondence on government letterhead. I've spent the past 3 months documenting Alex's career, Grandpa announced. Not just the dramatic rescue that opened our eyes, but the years of service that came before it, the cases he's worked, the recognition he's received from colleagues and supervisors, and the impact his work has had on protecting people who will never know his name. The scope of his research was impressive and slightly overwhelming. He had somehow gathered information about cases I had worked, commendations I had received, and testimonials from colleagues and supervisors that I hadn't known existed in written form. How did you get all this? I asked, genuinely curious about his investigative methods. Grandpa smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had successfully completed a challenging project. I may be 75, but I still know how to make phone calls and write letters. Your director Mitchell was very helpful once I explained what I was trying to accomplish. The revelation that he had been in contact with my superior was both touching and mortifying. I could only imagine Director Mitchell's reaction to receiving inquiries from my grandfather about my career achievements and service record. The point of this exercise, Grandpa continued, removing a large frame from the box, wasn't to embarrass Alex or to create a shrine to his accomplishments. The point was to create a permanent record of what real service looks like, so that future generations of this family will understand the difference between visible success and meaningful contribution. He turned the frame around to reveal a professionally mounted display that took my breath away. It was a comprehensive timeline of my career, including photographs from my graduation from the FBI Academy, certificates from specialized training programs, commendations from successful cases, and a letter of appreciation from Senator Hawkins that I hadn't known she had sent to my family. The centerpiece of the display was a photograph I didn't recognize, showing me in tactical gear during what appeared to be a training exercise or actual operation. The professional quality of the image suggested it had come from official bureau files, raising questions about how Grandpa had obtained access to such materials. Where did that photo come from? I asked, studying the image with curiosity and concern. Director Mitchell's office sent it along with your service record, Grandpa replied matter-of-factly. He said it was taken during a joint training exercise with other federal agencies, and that it represented the kind of work you do that the public never sees. The collaboration between my grandfather and my supervisor was both impressive and slightly alarming. The idea that they had been corresponding about my career without my knowledge created a mixture of pride and anxiety about boundaries between my personal and professional lives. But this is just the beginning, Grandpa announced, his voice taking on the tone that indicated he had more surprises in store. Emma, would you bring out the other boxes? My sister disappeared again and returned with 2 additional boxes, both larger than the first. The accumulation of mysterious packages suggested that Grandpa's project had been far more extensive than anyone had imagined. I've also been in contact with the local historical society, the city council, and several community organizations, he continued, his excitement becoming more evident. They're all interested in recognizing Alex's service and using his story as an example of how ordinary citizens can contribute to national security in extraordinary ways. The implications of this statement sent a chill through me. Community recognition was flattering, but it also represented exactly the kind of public exposure that could complicate my ongoing work and create security risks for both me and my family. Grandpa, I appreciate the sentiment, but public recognition for my work could create complications, I said carefully, trying to express concern without diminishing his enthusiasm. I thought you might say that, he replied with a knowing smile. So I worked with Director Mitchell to make sure that any public recognition would be appropriate and wouldn't compromise your operational security. The revelation that my supervisor had been consulted about community recognition efforts was both reassuring and surreal. The coordination between my family and my professional supervisors represented a level of integration between my personal and work life that I was still learning to navigate. Emma opened the second box and began removing items that made the scope of Grandpa's project even more impressive. Professional quality brochures, presentation materials, and what appeared to be curriculum materials for educational programs. The Historical Society wants to create an exhibit about local heroes, Grandpa explained, using Alex's story as an example of how national security is protected by people who live and work in communities like ours. The City Council is interested in establishing a community awareness program that would teach residents how to recognize and report suspicious activities. The educational component was intriguing and aligned with my professional belief in the importance of community involvement in security efforts. If properly managed, such programs could genuinely contribute to public safety while providing recognition for the work that federal agents did. And the school district, Emma added, clearly having been briefed on the full scope of the project, wants to develop a curriculum about careers in federal law enforcement, using Uncle Alex as an example of how students from small towns can contribute to important work. The career education aspect was particularly appealing. One of the challenges federal agencies faced was recruiting qualified candidates from diverse geographical backgrounds. If my story could inspire young people from small communities to consider careers in law enforcement, it would represent a meaningful contribution beyond my individual casework. Marcus, who had been listening with expressions ranging from amazement to embarrassment, finally spoke up. Grandpa, this is incredible. But I have to ask, does this mean our entire family is going to become public figures? The question was reasonable and reflected concerns I shared. Community recognition was one thing, but sustained public attention could create ongoing complications for family members who hadn't chosen careers that required security considerations. The recognition will focus on Alex and his work, Grandpa assured him. The family's role will be presented as an example of how observant citizens can contribute to law enforcement efforts, but the emphasis will be on encouraging community awareness rather than creating celebrity status. The distinction was important and suggested that Grandpa had given considerable thought to the potential implications of public recognition. His collaboration with Director Mitchell had apparently included discussions about appropriate boundaries and security considerations. There's one more thing, Grandpa announced, reaching into the third box, the most important part of this entire project. He removed a leather-bound book that appeared to be professionally printed and bound. The cover bore the title Hidden Heroes, Service Beyond Recognition, and featured a photograph of our family from the birthday party, taken before the evening's dramatic events had unfolded. I've written a book, he announced, his pride evident in his voice. Not just about Alex's career, but about the principle that real heroism often exists in forms that society doesn't recognize or celebrate. About the importance of supporting family members whose contributions we don't understand. About the difference between visible success and meaningful service. The scope of his project was breathtaking. In 3 months, my 75-year-old grandfather had conducted research, coordinated with federal agencies, developed community programs, and written a book about principles that extended far beyond my individual story. Grandpa, I don't know what to say, I managed, genuinely overwhelmed by the effort he had invested, and the thought he had put into addressing issues I hadn't even realized needed attention. You don't need to say anything, he replied, handing me a copy of the book. You've already said everything that needed to be said by living a life of service. This is just making sure that other people understand what that kind of life looks like and why it matters. I opened the book to find a dedication page that made my throat tighten with emotion. To Alex Thompson, and to all the hidden heroes who protect us in ways we never see, ask for nothing in return, and deserve recognition we too often fail to provide. The dedication was followed by a foreword written by Director Mitchell, explaining the importance of community support for federal law enforcement and the role that observant citizens played in maintaining national security. The professional endorsement transformed Grandpa's personal project into something with genuine educational and policy implications. As family members gathered around to examine the book and the other raw materials Grandpa had prepared, I found myself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had begun with Marcus calling me worthless at a birthday party and had evolved into community recognition, legislative consultation, and now educational programs designed to inspire future generations. There's going to be a formal presentation next month, Emma added, clearly excited about the upcoming event. The mayor, the police chief, and representatives from Senator Hawkins' office will be there. Director Mitchell is planning to attend as well. The formal ceremony represented a level of public recognition that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. From being dismissed as the family disappointment to being honored by local and federal officials was a transformation that still felt surreal. Victoria, who had remained quiet through most of the presentation, finally spoke with tears in her eyes. "Alex, I owe you an apology that goes beyond anything I said before. I spent years making jokes about your career and your choices, and it turns out you were doing work that literally protects our democracy. I'm ashamed of how wrong I was." The apology was heartfelt, but it also reflected the ongoing process of adjustment that my entire family was still navigating. The revelation of my true career had forced everyone to reconsider assumptions they had held for years, and that reconsideration was still generating new insights and regrets. "Victoria, you couldn't have known what you didn't know," I replied, though I couldn't completely hide my satisfaction at the recognition of how wrong her assumptions had been. "The important thing is that we understand each other now." As the afternoon progressed and family members examined the materials Grandpa had prepared, I found myself thinking about the upcoming formal ceremony and the ongoing process of integrating my professional recognition with my personal relationships. The balance between public acknowledgement and operational security would require careful management, but the potential benefits for community awareness and career inspiration made the challenges worthwhile. My phone buzzed with a text message from Director Mitchell. "Alex, your grandfather is an impressive man. The materials he's prepared for the Community Recognition Program are exactly the kind of public outreach we need to build support for federal law enforcement. Looking forward to the ceremony next month." The endorsement from my supervisor confirmed that Grandpa's project had been professionally managed and appropriately coordinated. The recognition would serve broader purposes beyond personal acknowledgement, contributing to community education and public support for law enforcement efforts. As the evening wound down and family members began to head home, Grandpa asked me to stay behind for a private conversation. We sat in his living room, surrounded by the materials he had prepared, and the photographs documenting a career that had been invisible to his family for far too long. "Alex," he said, his voice carrying the wisdom of 7.5 decades, "I want you to understand why this project was so important to me. It wasn't just about recognizing your achievements or correcting the mistakes our family made in understanding your work." He paused, looking out the window at the street where federal agents had coordinated a senator's rescue just 3 months earlier. "It was about making sure that future generations of our family, and families like ours, understand that heroism takes many forms. That service often requires sacrifice that others don't see. That worth isn't always visible to the people who should recognize it most." The lesson extended far beyond my individual situation, touching on fundamental questions about how society values different types of contribution and how families support members whose work they don't understand. "Your brother called you worthless," he continued, "but the truth is that your worth was always there. We just didn't have the eyes to see it, or the wisdom to recognize it. This project is my attempt to make sure that kind of blindness doesn't happen again." The conversation was both deeply personal and broadly philosophical, reflecting Grandpa's belief that individual stories could teach universal lessons about recognition, respect, and the true meaning of contribution to society. "Thank you, Grandpa," I said, meaning it more deeply than those simple words could convey. Not just for the recognition, but for understanding what this work means and why it matters. He smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had successfully completed a meaningful project. "Heroes shouldn't have to work in complete invisibility, Alex. Sometimes they need someone to shine a light on the good work they're doing, not for glory, but so that other people understand what real service looks like." As I drove home that evening, carrying copies of the book Grandpa had written and thinking about the formal ceremony that would take place next month, I reflected on the extraordinary transformation that had occurred in my life and family relationships. The worthless burden had become a community hero, the family disappointment had become an inspiration for future generations, and the invisible federal agent had become a symbol of hidden service that deserved recognition. But more than personal vindication, the recognition represented an opportunity to contribute to broader understanding of the work that federal agents did and the importance of community support for law enforcement efforts. If my story could inspire other young people to consider careers in public service or help other families better understand and support relatives whose work required secrecy, then the recognition would serve purposes far beyond personal satisfaction. The journey from worthless to honored, from dismissed to celebrated, from invisible to recognized, was complete. But as I thought about the upcoming ceremony, the ongoing legislative work with Senator Hawkins, and the community programs that Grandpa had helped establish, I realized that the story was still being written. The recognition was not an ending, but a beginning of new opportunities to serve, to inspire, and to demonstrate that true worth is always present, even when it's not immediately visible to the people who should see it most clearly. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.